Hello, everybody, and welcome to this fourth webinar in the series, Climate Change, Climate Justice, Climate Action, the Basics for Churches. It's a webinar series offered by the California Nevada Climate Justice Ministries Task Force, and Andrew Baer and I have organized this presentation, and we will be the ones speaking tonight. And tonight's webinar is on climate action, comparing policy solutions. I'm going to be offering a reflection tonight, and I want to begin this session on comparing public policies with putting it in a frame that is consistent with Jesus's teachings and his passion, really, for what he called the kingdom of God. Some people today call it the reign of God, the kingdom of God, God's dream, God's vision. Martin Luther King Jr. Referred to the beloved community in a similar way. But I want to propose something that actually comes from my book, that is the book, my most recent book, Love in a Time of Climate Change. Actually, a different book, the book on the cross in the midst of creation. And I want to refer to an idea that I talk about in this book that is referring to the fact that there are two paradigms at work in our world today. There is the dominant paradigm, and it's the paradigm that Marcus Borg called the normalcy of civilization. The normalcy of civilization with the rulers and the governments and the institutions, the corporations, everything intertwined and dominating the world, and the values that are at play in the normalcy of civilization, such as hierarchy, wealth, and worldly power backed by violence. Some people call it corporate globalization. Walter Wink called it the domination system. And David Korten, who wrote the book, When Corporations Rule the World, called it the paradigm of empire. And at the same time, there's another paradigm at work. And that paradigm is an emerging paradigm, a paradigm that is based on the values that Jesus proclaimed, that Jesus lived, such as compassion, which characterized his life, equity, inclusion, caring for community, for others, for the most vulnerable, and domination, ending the domination system, instead having egalitarian sharing at the table, and nonviolence, which also characterized Jesus's life. So this alternative paradigm is also called the earth paradigm. That was what David Korten called it. And it's an emerging system that is community-based, people-friendly, and really centered on caring for the earth and how the earth cares for us. And so I want to just read a little bit from my book. And I want to mention what Martin Core from the Third World Network says about this. He says that we need to work within the dominant paradigm. We must, because that's where we live. That's a reality in our day. And we need to work in that particular paradigm because we want to make sure that it is as fair as we can make it, as just as we can make it. We want to prevent as much harm as possible to both people and to the earth. And at the same time, he says, we need to nurture seeds of hope to bring alive this second paradigm and infuse it into the first paradigm as a kind of transition. And this worldview offers an alternative to the domination system. And it's consistent also with indigenous views, both traditional and contemporary. And it's consistent with the reality of God as not just transcendent, but also immanent within creation. As John Wesley said, God is the soul of the universe. And so it also recalls the idea that Jesus spoke of and that we think of, the image of the reign of God, and reminds us of that. And also there's a parallel understanding in the secular world that is spoken of as a slogan for the climate justice movement, a slogan for the global justice movement, and that is another world is possible. And so that's the faith that one thing about the dominant paradigm is that it's considered the real world. And if you think outside the box of that real world, reality, then you're considered not that up to what really needs to be done, what needs to happen, how things are. And Jesus thought outside the box. The disciples thought outside the box. We are followers of Jesus called to think outside the box. And sometimes that means you're discounted, you're avoided even, or even persecuted. So there's nothing for us to fear as followers of Jesus Christ. And those two paradigms, we can use those as a reference point when we listen to the solutions and the policies that are in place to that people are suggesting and taking action on to address the issues of climate change and climate justice. Okay, now that I've shared that reflection, I want to talk a little bit about where we are with the global policies and what's going on with our global solutions and global goals and targets. I was at the first climate conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. It was called the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, and that was where the first climate treaty was signed. The Framework Convention on Climate Change, signed by George H.W. Bush and ratified by the U.S. Senate. It was a treaty. And at Rio, we had several agreements, and there were agreements that we would, as wealthier nations, contribute to the poorer nations to help them leapfrog over the mistakes that we made that have caused such environmental damage. And at that climate conference and environmental conference, we agreed that ending poverty and ending the environmental crisis and the climate crisis, they had to go together. It was called the Conference on Environment and Development at the time, and we talked a lot about sustainable development. And it was a very hopeful time, featured by media outlets all over the world. And we were going to solve these problems together. And here we are at our more recent climate conference, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where we had the General Secretary, United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, speak about this as we are on the road to climate hell and our foot is still on the accelerator, in spite of the fact that we were following up with the Paris agreements. We were there to solidify commitments based on the great success that seemed to have happened in Paris. And of course, the United States was back in the Paris Agreement, and it was looking better. But now at Sharm el-Sheikh, we were hearing that we were heading for a climate hell. So what's going on here? How is this happening? I want you to know that with Paris, both China and India are on track to overachieve the commitments they made in Paris. Every nation submitted voluntary targets and of how much they would cut of their emissions. And we've talked about China and India. People sometimes point to China and say, but why should we do anything? Because China's doing worse than we are. We've addressed that in different ways. But these two countries are on track to achieve their Paris commitments. The United States has not been. But now, with the new Inflation Reduction Act, things are looking more hopeful. You can see how emissions have started to go down as of about 2005. And you can see in the pink zone and the red that as we approach 2030, that they are still poised to go down about at the same level that they've been going down little by little. But the Inflation Reduction Act takes it much further. And at the best scenario would be that the Inflation Reduction Act would take us down to our Paris target. And of course, the Inflation Reduction Act is the most recent legislation that was passed, a landmark climate agreement that was passed last year in 2022. So is this a great thing? Is this problem solved? No, because what the fact is that the targets that the countries agreed to at Paris are not going to keep us at the level of warming that we need to be at in order to prevent, climate chaos. So we've already warmed by 1 degree Celsius. You can see that in the bottom arrow. The next arrow up, where it's orange to dark orange, that is a very dangerous boundary already. And that means the 1.5 degree limit that we've agreed to in Paris and since, that's already in the climate system. We're pretty much bound to get to 1.5 degrees. Still trying to hold it there. But the 2 degree upper limit Paris target takes us still. It's a very dangerous boundary, as I said, even there. But the Paris emissions, that path that we're on with the Paris agreements, if everyone keeps their commitments, we're going to hit 3 degrees Celsius anyway, or come close to hitting 3 degrees Celsius. And as this chart says, and many scientists agree, would be outright chaos. And then if we talk about the Paris agreements, the actual warming, even if the voluntary commitments are kept with the longer term feedbacks, that will take us to 4 degrees Celsius, which is, it says, incompatible with an organized global community. So we still have a lot of work to do to get to where we need to go if we're going to keep warming to 1.5, even to 2 degrees. Lots of work to do. Why? After all these years, here's a group of people who made the decisions. There were a lot of other people, lots of delegates to the UNCED conference, hundreds and hundreds of people to the global forum outside the conference. You notice certainly that it's mostly men. In Paris, mostly men, a few women, a few more women, it looks like. And then in Sharm el-Sheikh, mostly men again. So already we're seeing that the people who are actually making the decisions are not representative of the global community and not representative of the people who are marginalized and are really suffering the effects of climate change the most, although some of the people here certainly do live in those marginalized countries and are familiar with what's happening in their countries and concerned. Plus, at the COP meetings, their fossil fuel delegates at the last two have outnumbered national delegations. Actually, this is from COP 26, where the fossil fuel representatives outnumbered any of the national delegations. In COP 27, it was still the case, except for Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia had more delegates. So there's a problem here that people would say is systemic, and that I would say is systemic. It's representing the dominant system, what Walter Wink called the domination system, and decisions about climate are being made in that context. Here's a very cynical view. COP27 news, fund for loss and damage established. No word on funders or mechanism. For details, see COP28. Star, 1.5 degrees global warming limit to remain, despite no action against fossil fuel pollution. For details, see COP29, COP30, et cetera, et cetera. And if you remember from previous presentations, fossil fuels were not even mentioned in the final climate agreement, in any of the final climate agreements. So, so this is a cynical, kind of not very hopeful view of what's going on in the climate conferences. I have a lot of hope for the movement for climate justice. The people who are outside of the conference, the people who are around the world doing demonstrations and webinars and prayer gatherings to call on world leaders and taking things into their own hands in some ways by actions for justice, loss and damage, and fueling the loss and damage fund. And here's another climate demonstration. This was inside COP26. So keep 1.5 alive. Every climate promise must be kept. There's a very strong movement for climate justice. And to me, it brings hope that things can shift. It's this alternative paradigm that is planting seeds to infuse the new paradigm, the emerging paradigm, into the dominant paradigm that is at work today. And so we talk about, in the climate justice movement, one of the favorite signs for almost every climate demonstration is system change, not climate change. And of course, this was at the Paris climate talk. So system change, not climate change. And I will leave it at that and turn it over to Andrew.
Well, thank you, Sharon. And welcome, everyone. My name is Andrew Baer, and we're here tonight, as Sharon said, to discuss climate policy. And, you know, while I'm not a policy expert, it's something that I've been very interested in for a long time. And hoping tonight you'll understand why. Because, you know, we talk about the Paris Agreement, and, you know, the peoples of the earth, represented by their leaders who have come to the Paris for that COP, agreed to keep the average global temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius over pre-industrial levels. And so the question is so how do we do that? No one nation can do that on their own. And so it's going to take international cooperation, and the way each nation implements what their strategy is going to be for meeting what their goals are to keep everyone on track is policy. Policy is what drives regulations, emission reductions targets, and offering incentives for, how do we move society towards these goals in a way that's not going to be harmful to most people, right? So offering incentives and tax credits and things like that to help move the economy and technology in a direction where we're going to be on track for meeting the goals. So anyways, policy is super important, because without it, we're not going to be able to achieve the goals. So yeah, 1.5 is the goal that we're going for, as agreed at the global community has agreed to that. And again, the reason I think we talked about it in previous webinars, but the reason for 1.5 is because that's a degree of warming that hopefully keeps us from going from climate change being, bad, to climate change being catastrophic for a variety of reasons. And there are tipping points that can be triggered that can just change global systems into a new state that we're no longer able to control. So this is the limit that, and there's a lot of people who are now predicting that we will likely cross that 1.5 degree Celsius. And some people react to that saying, well, then, game over, what's the use? And the reality is if we do go over, when we do go over, we can't give up, because every 10th of a degree of warming makes things worse. And so we need to continue doing everything we can to bring emissions down in order to have a habitable planet. So even if we do, I just want to say that, because there's a good chance that we will cross 1.5. And that does not mean we've failed. It means we missed the target, but we need to double down and continue working harder and harder to minimize how much further over 1.5 we go. So I just wanted to say that. I shared this graph last week. I think it's a helpful graph because it shows, how steep the emissions cuts need to be to meet the goal of staying 1.5 over pre-industrial temperatures, climate. And if you see on the left side of the screen around the year 2000, if we had started taking action then, you can see it's much more of a smooth slope. And you can see where we are right now, where it's a very steep slope indeed. So the longer we wait to take climate action, the more difficult it's going to be and challenging. And when we need to take drastic action, it's more likely to cause other effects than if we're able to take slower action. So the longer we wait, the harder the job's going to be. So that's why I wanted to share this particular graph. And there's some good news, because last year the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022 was passed and signed into law by President Biden. And the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, is the single most significant federal climate and clean energy legislation in United States history. So it's significant in that regard. And its provisions have the potential to cut greenhouse gases to the point where, like as Sharon showed, we can get close to or actually achieve what our target is as a nation to for our contribution to keeping global temperatures to 1.5. So the Inflation Reduction Act contains significant funding towards emission cutting measures such as tax breaks for low carbon energy, electric vehicles, and so on. So I'm going to just do a quick review of some of the details. And a lot of these are really significant. So the IRA is projected to reduce US emissions by about 40% by 2030 compared to 2005 levels. It puts the United States on path to meet the pledge that Biden made to cut emissions by 50 to 52% from 2005 levels by 2030. By 2030, we could cut our annual emissions to a level that's equal to taking 215 million gas-powered vehicles off the road, or equal to shuttering 268 coal-fired power plants. So that's a significant emission reduction. The bill could help avoid up to 3,900 premature deaths and asthma attacks as well due to air pollution. And families can save up to $1,800 in energy costs each year, it's projected, by utilizing programs that switch to electricity instead of fossil fuels. So it also offers tax credits and rebates to make homes more energy efficient by things like adding heat pumps, electric stoves, electric water heaters, and so on. It provides up to 7,500 clean vehicle tax credits for EVs that are built in North America, which also increases the manufacturing and creates jobs here in the United States. Also a 4,000 tax incentive for used clean vehicles, which can be more affordable for people like myself, for instance. There's a methane fee program that will make it progressively more costly for the energy industry to emit methane, which is a significant and powerful greenhouse gas. And what do we have next? As far as climate justice goes, there's $600 billion for frontline communities, including $3 billion for community-led projects, $3 billion to reconnect communities segregated and separated from highways and other infrastructure. And I don't think I'll read all of these, but it has some initiatives that are addressing environmental justice issues and providing support to frontline communities that are often not factored into these initiatives. $7 billion in grants for zero emission technology, benefiting low-income disadvantaged communities. $4 billion to cut air pollution near frontline communities, things like that. So there's a lot of good things in here. And significantly, the IRA can be a turning point for the US as a global leader on climate change. With President number 45, he withdrew from the Paris Agreement, and United States lost a lot of credibility and is the historically biggest contributor to greenhouse gases in the environment. When we pulled out, it was very damaging to international relations and whether or not nations can trust the United States to make good on its promises. And so this is started to help restore trust in the U.S. And there's a few other things here. Can I check in with either Joan or Sharon? How am I doing on time? I can't see my clock. Am I at time? Okay. Let me just quickly go through. There's a couple problems that I'm going to get to that later, but a lot of these benefits are contingent upon offering new offshore wind leasing to oil and gas projects. However, every ton of emission increase from these new projects, they're offset by at least 24 tons of emissions that are avoided through this act. So there's some troubling things in here, but on the whole, people who are analyzing this act say it's a significant contribution. Okay, back to Sharon.
All right. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some proposed and also policies that are already in place that are either what some people call false solutions, or they're insufficient, or even some are even misleading solutions. So, okay, so one policy that is often proposed, and right now it's being, I guess, advanced even in Europe. I didn't know that, but Andrew and I were talking about it. But the idea that natural gas is a bridge fuel, and indeed, in its initial use, it doesn't have the same impact as coal. However, this is fracking. This is how is extracted often and often in neighborhoods. Methane is what is the primary gas in natural gas. And so it is 36 times more polluting than carbon dioxide if you're considering it lingering in the atmosphere for 100 years. But in the first 20 years, it is 87 times more polluting than carbon dioxide. So methane is a very potent climate causing fossil fuel. And I'm really happy about the inclusion in the Inflation Reduction Act of the fees on methane. That's a good step. But I also want to mention what we do when we measure emissions and we say we're going to go to net zero and so on is what we use domestically. And what is happening with natural gas is you can see that it is being exported. And so it's gone up from 2014, as far as you can see, way up through 2022. And this is the projection for the future. So we may be stopping our fossil fuel emissions domestically, and we might be doing everything we can to get to net zero or to cut 50% by 2030. But the fact is the natural gas is on a trajectory of great of export. The bottom is imports. The blue is an import, the pink is an import, and the red, I believe that's exports to Canada, and I think to Canada. I believe, because I can't see it with the way my slides are set up, but the brownish color is exports to Mexico, and then the blue is exports to everywhere else. And this is the trajectory that we're on. So when we talk about it being a bridge fuel, and especially with the amount of leakages there is in the pipes as you're shipping methane, around the world. It's a very potent greenhouse gas. Methane is not a bridge to renewables. Cap and trade. This is one of the dominant ways that our policymakers deal with climate, with carbon emissions. So the way it works is that if there are some of the bigger factories and the bigger industries are given allowances, and people sometimes call it permits to pollute. And so you can see that the allowances go to certain industries, not smaller companies, but the larger companies. And so they have allowances, and so they're limited on how much they can emit. And if they go overboard and they emit excess CO2, they can buy carbon credits from companies that, for instance, from companies that have not used all their allowances. And so you can see that that's what's happening here. So the company that has emitted excess emissions now has to spend money and buy allowances from the company that had leftover allowances for sale. Another way it works is that you can use your money to buy carbon credits from different projects. There's a whole an array of many projects. I'm not sure if Andrew's going to cover carbon markets, but this is actually a market, and it was initiated by the fossil fuel companies. It's a market where you can hold on to your credits. You can, hold on to them so they become more valuable, or you can, you can manipulate the prices of the carbon credits. But some carbon credits, there are many carbon credits that are really not really balancing it out at all. There are companies that are good at saying that they're going to tricking the market. It's easily gamed so that you can say that you're going to build a big factory that's going to emit so much carbon and then not build it, and then you get carbon credits. You earn carbon credits that you can then trade. You can, well, for instance, in California, in our forests, Sierra Pacific, the largest private landowner who clear cuts and replants what they call even age forests, they get carbon credits for that because they claim that after 80 years, more carbon is absorbed than is absorbed in an old growth forest, which I believe is not true. Studies that I've read have shown that that's not true. So it's kind of a smoke and mirrors. So you can't really just go with this. It does raise money, and California's carbon cap and trade system has been lauded as successful because it has raised money that can then be donated into very good different things that are good for the climate, different projects that are good for the climate. But that doesn't mean that this system itself is really that great. And I will put in the chat a movie, a small film. I couldn't show it tonight. It's called Cap and Trade, the story of Cap and Trade. It's 10 minutes, and it actually explains the whole system and what it was built upon and why it's not sufficient for dealing with carbon. And this is an example. We're collecting carbon credits for the first world. People, they really are. They're actually, indigenous people are being driven off their lands to create tree farms, plantations, so that corporations can create industries in the developed nations that pollute, and in our frontline communities that are joining with indigenous communities saying, don't do this. We don't want carbon credits to allow that kind of pollution to be coming into our neighborhoods because of carbon credits. So there are a lot of problems with carbon credits. Carbon offsets are similar. It sounds like a good idea, because we want to, if we go somewhere, we want to be able to pay if we have to fly, which I have to. I usually take the train. I'm going one way by train, but I must fly back. And so, of course, we want to offset that by maybe a 10% fee or something like that to offset it. But actually, the offsets, that, CO2 is emitted. The offsets often don't absorb that CO2 back into the ground. They may pay for a wind farm, they may pay for a solar project, but that doesn't take the CO2 that you've emitted out of the air. Theoretically, it might prevent other CO2 or methane from going into the air, but that's not, but that isn't guaranteed. And often, as I say, those projects are, they're easily gamed. Carbon offsets can undermine Indigenous rights. This is from Indigenous people. The expansion of carbon credits puts pressure on Indigenous and forest communities for land needed by offset projects. And so they can be made to move off their land when they are the ones who have been living there, protecting their land for generations. And I think you might know that we've talked about it, that 80% of biodiversity is on land that is cared for by Indigenous people. And so many people on frontline communities say carbon pricing is colonialism, defend the land. Okay, get to net zero by 2050. There are a lot of organizations and states and countries who are talking about getting to net zero. We have, I think, 11 or 12 agencies of the United Methodist Church that are pointing toward net zero by 2050. Some of them are looking at shorter range targets and moving in that direction now. But it also can be used as to postpone action, to imagine that you're going to use geoengineering, to imagine that the technologies for carbon capture is going to be all, well advanced enough to suck that carbon that you emit today and for the next however many years back into the away, so that you're not that your emissions today don't count. So it can be a false solution. You need short-term targets as well. And for instance, look at all these companies pledging net zero emissions by 2050. And some of them do not plan, like Shell and BP, don't plan to have their product be net zero, just their facilities and their projects. So there are a lot of problems with net zero emissions, and it isn't a sufficient solution. So that's mostly what I'm talking about. Remember, again, as Andrew was saying, we need to keep to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the target that the world has agreed on. CO2 emissions would have to be declined by 45% by 2030. And then we have the 2050 goal. I want to mention, I'll go back just one to net zero. Net zero means by that time, you're not emitting any more fossil fuels than you are responsible for absorbing or offsetting in a real way. It doesn't mean that you're at absolute zero and you're not polluting at all with greenhouse gases. So 2050, that's pretty far long advanced to be thinking that we'll stop where we are, absorb all that. So it's it's in part of the mix, but it's not sufficient. And it too can be used as a smokescreen. So that's my presentation on some of the false solutions that are being offered. And I'm going to turn it over again to Andrew.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And yeah, I see it the same way that those net zero by 2050 goals. It's like if I set myself a goal and it's like I'm going to do this, it's like right now I'm wanting to lose 15 pounds to reach my ideal weight, and I'm going to pledge to get there by 2050. So that's just using an example like that gives an example of how it doesn't really put any pressure on what we're doing today or even next year or the next year. So that's really important. So thank you for sharing that. I'm going to share a slide again, and I'm going to talk also about carbon offsets, and I'm going to speak specifically about carbon offsets in using trees. There we go. So carbon offsets and tree planting. So as Sharon described, carbon offsets are a way to pay other people to reduce their emissions or absorb CO2 to offset our own. For example, another example of taking a flight. If I take a flight, I'm putting CO2 into the atmosphere where it's going to heat the planet for a long time. So to offset this carbon that I've just been responsible for putting in there, I can pay another company who promises to use the money I pay to take that carbon out of the atmosphere. And this is the concept of carbon offsets. And a lot of the carbon offsets are done by tree planting. And I just want to begin by saying I love trees. They're some of my favorite people, and I like to spend a lot of time with trees, and I love planting trees and supporting trees, protecting trees. So I don't want to come off as anti-tree, but when we use trees to offset carbon emissions, there's a few problems. And that's what I want to share with you right now, because it really is, there's so many initiatives for planting trees as a way to combat climate change. There's the 3 billion tree initiative, and a lot of corporations are latching onto this. It sounds green, it sounds good. We know that trees absorb CO2. Everyone loves trees, so what could be wrong with that? So I'm going to share a few issues with using trees to offset carbon. The first one is the lifespan of trees. A newly planted tree can take as many as 20 years to capture the amount of CO2 that the offset scheme promises. And so that tree might live for another 100 or 200 years. But the carbon that was put in the atmosphere can stay in the atmosphere for a much longer time than that tree is going to be in there. For example, for carbon that I emit today, 20% of that CO2 is still going to be in the atmosphere over 1,000 years from now. So the lifespan of the tree is much shorter than the life of the carbon that I'm putting in there. So, and it takes, up to 20 years for that tree to start generating the full amount of carbon that it's calculated for. So that's one of the problems with these schemes. The second one is that many tree planting projects are monocultures. And when they do these calculations, they'll look at an intact forest, count the trees, estimate how much is this forest sequestering of CO2, and then kind of calculate how much per tree. And And then, that's the amount that's assigned to each tree. So each tree is, that amount that was calculated based on a fully intact forest. And as we all probably know, this image that's the background screen is an image of a tree plantation, a monoculture. And so it's just kind of like driving through Illinois and Iowa and Nebraska, where you see rows and rows and rows of corn. Rows of trees are not a forest. Forest has a diversity of plant and animal life. There's qualities that the soil has in an intact forest that a tree plantation isn't going to have. So it's more like a Christmas tree farm than planting a forest, and they do not have the same ability to sequester the same amount of CO2 as a intact forest. The third problem is, especially it's getting worse due to climate change. I think we're all aware that forest fires are increasing, and we here in California are certainly aware of that, and a lot of trees are burning. So just because we plant trees doesn't mean they're going to survive. And there's also certain pests like the bark beetle that are expanding their range with the warming planet. So there's a lot of things, a lot of reasons why the trees that we're planting today may not survive to their full lifespan and sequester. And so if those trees burn or die prematurely, then they're releasing that carbon right back into the atmosphere. The fourth reason is the available land. Oxfam analyzed tree planting offset pledges in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow and found that the amount of land that would be needed to meet all the pledges of using trees planting as offsets, when they calculated the pledges of the various nations, that amount of trees would require an area that 5 times the size of India, which is, so where are we going to get that much land to plant trees? So that's just a basic physics problem. And then we have accounting tricks and exaggerations. There's a new study that just came out in the last this year that a group of scientists, universities, journalists, and investigated an offset company called Vera, which is the world's largest offset company. And they found that more than 90% of the credits that they sell are absolutely worthless and represent no genuine carbon reductions whatsoever. And to be fair, the company Vera has said that no, your study is wrong. We are legit. And I think that they'll be formulating a response to this study. But a lot of the things that they said the researchers didn't calculate turn out to be they did factor that into the calculations. So let it suffice to say that there's a lot of exaggeration and kind of accounting tricks that can dramatically exaggerate the impact of offsets. And 6th is climate justice, and Sharon talked about this. Often carbon offset schemes have wealthy nations and corporations from the global north deciding, well, we're going to continue to emit our CO2, and we're going to pay countries in the global south to protect their land. And this is a form of colonialism. And asking weaker nations to bear the cost of the lifestyle of the wealthy nations. That's certainly a climate justice problem. So one example is, and Sharon mentioned this about people being evicted from their land. Amnesty International reports that land in Kenya that was put aside for carbon offsets resulted in the Sangwar people who have lived in that forest from ancestral times. They were physically removed and forced off of their land, which is a really bad human rights violation. And it also is ignoring the fact that, you know, the land that's occupied by indigenous peoples is the healthiest land, and it's going to absorb the most carbon. It's going to do a lot better than people from outside treating it like a tree farm, right? And then the seventh problem, and this is the last one I'll mention, is the danger that carbon offsets can support people and nations in continuing with business as usual, with little incentive to actually reduce their emissions. So for example, if I think I can offset the carbon emissions of an airplane flight, then I feel less guilty about flying, and maybe I'll just continue flying because I don't have to worry about my carbon emissions because I can buy an offset. I can pay a certain amount extra, tack it onto my plane flight, and fly guilt-free. And that disincentivizes my lifestyle in trying to minimize airplane flights. And again, I want to come back to that I'm not against tree planting. I love trees, and it would be wonderful if everyone listening to this went out and planted trees. It's just a problem when we use planting trees as an excuse to continue emitting fossil fuels and going towards fossil fuel reductions, which is really the most important thing we need to do for a habitable planet. So Sharon also talked about carbon capture a little bit. I'm going to talk about it a little bit more here. Studies by the IPCC have shown that carbon capture and storage has the potential to reduce carbon emissions by millions of metric tons, and they are likely going to be an integral part of meeting climate goals. Again, trying to meet the 1.5. So IPCC is saying that this is going to be an important part of global strategies for doing this. So CCS, or carbon capture and storage, uses industrial processes to remove CO2 from fossil fuel power stations, as well as other energy-intensive industries, and from gas fields. There's a lot of escape of emissions in those processes, and this process captures that, and then you can store it. And if you look at this image, the image on the right is you can sequester this in the earth where it won't be emitted into the atmosphere, and it's safe. And if you look on the image on the right, I don't think you can see the same image. That's what fossil fuel companies are doing, is when they say we're doing carbon capture and sequestration, what they're actually doing is taking that captured CO2 and then using it for other processes to extract even more greenhouse gases. So most often when they do this, they've taken the CO2 from its original place, like from methane or from oil, and they're extracting it out of the ground, and then they're going to capture some of that, And then they're going to use that captured CO2 to help extract even more. And so when you do this, you're not sequestering it in the earth, you're just using it to extract more fossil fuels. So it's not actually reducing emissions at all. And fossil fuel companies, when they do this carbon capture and sequestration, they get a tax subsidy for doing that. So at this point, CCS amounts to fossil fuel greenwashing. It's touted as a solution to CO2 emissions from fossil fuel industry, but instead it's a technology that's used to extract even more fossil fuels. So this is an image here of well, and yeah, just it's called enhanced recovery when you use the CO2 that you've captured and you use it to extract a gas or oil that is more difficult to extract. You can use that captured CO2 to extract even more, and that's called enhanced recovery. So global CCS projects, another issue is the scale of the technology is very small at this point. CCS projects capture about 42.6 million tons of CO2 every year, which is less than 6 hours worth of global emissions per year. So it's nowhere near the scale that's needed to make any impact on our climate goals. So that being said, in conversations with climate scientists and others who are working on carbon capture and sequestration, there is a lot of new technology being developed. And lots of times, when governments are in charge of the CCS and they are extracting the CO2 from these operations, they are sequestering them into the earth. They are also sequestering them into concrete as concrete is being manufactured, and it's sequestered in concrete that can be used for infrastructure and other things like that. And there's a lot of research and development going into direct air capture, which is instead of trying to recover fossil fuel emissions that are coming from industrial processes, oil refineries, fracking, and things like that. It's just extracting it from the air. And again, right now, it's nowhere near the scale it needs to be. So it's a problem if we think we don't have to reduce our emissions that fast, because we can use this technology to just suck the carbon out of the air. However, 50 years from now, whatever level of CO2 is in the atmosphere, that stays there for hundreds and hundreds of years. 20% of it is there for thousands of years. So that's not going anywhere. And so, whatever level of climate change impacts we're experiencing, we're still going to need to get that CO2 out of the atmosphere. So this is a technology that's supported by climate scientists that I know and people working on policy, because it's going to be needed. We're going to be needing to take CO2 out of the atmosphere. But we can't do this as a reason to slow our reductions in emissions. We need to continue doing that as quickly as possible. So I'm going to spend another couple minutes on just looking at a couple of success stories of cities. I looked at both cities and states, and I focused on California and Nevada because that's our annual conference here. And here's a picture of San Jose. And I lived in San Jose for about 12 years. And San Jose is doing a lot of innovative work. The city has aimed for carbon neutrality by 2030, which is a very aggressive goal. In 2019, they declared a climate emergency and adopted policy that includes attaining all electric zero net carbon in all new municipal facilities, prohibiting natural gas in new construction projects citywide, and partnering with San Jose Clean Energy to provide 100% carbon-free energy to all residents. It's also committed to prioritizing the equitable transition to decarbonization and engaging environmental justice communities that have traditionally borne the brunt of environmental degradation. So the city is working with communities, indigenous communities, low-income communities, the elderly, children, the disabled communities, in the planning, the policy, and the program development and delivery to make sure that this decarbonization is equitable and benefits all communities within the city. So the city is moving away from natural gas use in existing buildings, which makes up 34% of the city's emissions. The costs and cultural barriers, as you can imagine, can definitely get in the way of residents upgrading their properties. It's expensive to decarbonize your house. The full electrification might be an easy adjustment for people that work at Google, but for most people, and especially working people and folks that do not have financial resources, these can be insurmountable costs. So the city is working with these communities to help support in finding ways. And some of the examples of what they're doing is they're partnering with a climate advisor from Natural Resources Defense Council that's working with groups representing San Jose's working class, Latino, and Vietnamese communities to co-create decarbonization plans that address workforce training, financing, tenant protections in order to build lower emissions and create lower emissions. And these are also, benefiting some of the residents because a lot of the training is they have job skills in a rapidly expanding economy that's going green. Okay. So I was going to cover California, but you can look that up on California's website. I looked at Nevada and I looked at Reno, and because I was wanting to highlight some good work that's happening in Nevada, and in my research into that this week, I wasn't finding anything that was really creating the change needed to meet the climate goals that we need to do. So if any of you know of initiatives and policies that are enacted in Nevada, please reach out to us, because we do want to highlight. We know there's a lot of good people in Nevada doing really good work, and would love to highlight what's happening in Nevada as well.
Thank you. I'm going to just list off a couple of things we didn't cover. Green hydrogen, geoengineering, the many new technologies, wood biomass, which sounds maybe good, but not so much. And I just wanted to mention that the way I organized my reflection early on about the dominant system and the alternative emerging system, I want to make clear that the dominant system, the policies that are supported for the most part are policies that will make money for someone, and generally for the those who already have money. So the Inflation Reduction Act was is such a benefit, and it does have the methane fees placing, which is a kind of regulation. It's financial, but incentive. But a lot of what is considered realistic is something that will make money. So some of these things will, some of them won't, if we're going to be taking the whole picture of possibilities. So I also want to talk a little bit about hopeful policies. I'm going to start by reading something from a different book of mine, which is Love in a Time of Climate Change. And I want to make the case that it's not just Republican or Democrat, it's the system as a whole. I'm sure that Joe Biden is very much committed to climate justice and to working on having that be part of his legacy. I have no doubt about that. But I want to go back to the 2016 election when Bernie Sanders was the Democratic nominee, and he got so many delegates that he was able to help shape the party platform. And he selected Bill McKibben to be the person to represent climate issues on the Democratic Party platform. So this is Bill McKibben's report back on what happened at that meeting when they were developing the climate policies in the platform. He said, at about 11 p.m. in a half-deserted hotel ballroom, we got to the climate section of the platform, and that's where things got particularly obvious. We all agreed that America should be operating on 100% clean energy by 2050. But then I proposed, in one amendment after another, a series of ways we might actually get there. A carbon tax? Voted down. A ban on fracking? Voted down. An effort to keep fossil fuels in the ground, at least on federal land? Voted down. A measure to mandate that federal agencies weigh the climate impact of their decisions? Voted down. Even a plan to keep fossil fuel companies from taking private land by eminent domain? Voted down. We did, however, reach unanimous consent on more bike paths. And I go on to say, regardless of which party spent more in 2016 and regardless of who won, the process through which people are elected to high office in the United States is deeply corrupted by the rule of money and its distorting effects on democracy. And I think that's key, and that is critical to why people in the climate justice movement are also working on democracy and creating structures and helping to reform structures so they can be more democratic and more helpful. Okay, so the IPCC, the Intergovernmental on Climate Change, says the evidence is clear. The time for action is now. We can have emissions by 2030. And there are ways that we can do it. And there are bills before Congress that can have an impact. And there are quite a few other ways that we can address this. And next week, we'll talk about the climate justice movement and other options. The carbon fee and dividend movement is the policy that is really being supported by the Citizens Climate Lobby. And here's the idea. You place a fee on fossil fuels at the source, at the mine, at the well, or at the port. You aren't trying to figure out where all the emissions are. You're actually dealing with fossil fuels at the source. And you have a fee, call it a tax, return all the revenue to households equally so that everybody gets revenues equally. And there's a border adjustment on goods imported from or exported to countries without an equivalent price on carbon. So that it's a fee and dividend in that everyone has to pay the fee. If you go to the gas station and get gas, if the airlines, if they put fuel in their airplanes, then the price is going to go up for the people. So it's going to cost more money if there's a fee or a tax on carbon. The dividend is that it's all that money that comes in is divided up equally for man, woman, and child in the country and divvied up. And the idea is the wealthier people who use more fossil fuels will get a smaller dividend, and the people who are really struggling at the bottom will get the same dividend, but they don't use as much fossil fuels, so it won't cost them as much, and they'll get the same amount back as the wealthier people. So that's the idea of that. And it's like that, it's revenue neutral, and that's because the Citizens Climate Lobby want to have it be bipartisan support. And it does have some of bipartisan support. It's the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act. And you can look it up, carbon fee and dividend legislation will take you right there. And then there's another more legislation for the Green New Deal. And that is has planned to actually go along with the science to actually cut carbon emissions 45% by 2030, and at the same time create good union jobs. So it's like a just and sustainable, a program for justice and sustainability at the same time as reducing carbon emissions based on the science, based on the international agreement to 1.5. And so cutting it to that degree. And actually, because I reviewed it today, and some of the proposals in the Green New Deal are actually some of the things that are included in the Inflation Reduction Act. They're incentives, they're restructuring the grid, and trying to transition to clean energy. So so that is also something that's still alive. The Green New Deal is still a possibility, and hopefully it can make some progress. There are a lot of other possible ways to deal with carbon emissions. There are plenty of other policies that could work. I think I don't have time to, I'll look real quickly to see if there's any more that I want to say about that. I think not, but there are other policies and including the ones that Bill McKibben suggested, such as not allowing extraction on public lands. There's a fight going on right now because of the Willow project up in the Arctic, that people are saying we should not be approving that because it's public lands and it's going to create a great disruption for the people there as well as for the wildlife, and that isn't what we should be doing in the Arctic, especially on public lands. So there are a lot of struggles that are going on still and will continue to go on, pipeline struggles. I am going to, and I'm sure Andrew will too, will be bringing up local issues like issues of pipelines and issue of people power our next webinar, because it's based on climate justice and the global movement of climate justice. And I want to point out that the movement for climate justice really is strong. And their slogan, "Another world is possible," is all around, and they are serious about this. They are not just talking about it. They're not just doing demonstrations and direct action, but they are actually have projects in place. They are doing things locally. I'm sure that many of the positive gains that we had, including the Inflation Reduction Act, have come about because of all the pressure, the people power, and the pressure that people have put on and kept on. I know that for the organizations that I knew were disappointed in some of the provisions of the Inflation Reduction Act, but everybody got behind it because it is a step, and it's maybe a part of what's going on in the dominant paradigm, but it reduces harm. It gives us a chance to buy time and to continue to work on creating this alternative system and this alternative society that is going to be more earth friendly, that's going to be more community friendly, people friendly, healthier for our children and our grandchildren, and will be able to sustain the young people that are here today, but also our future generations. So take heart, and all that we learn from the gospel, and all of our prayer, and all of our communing together on these issues, and facing what's reality, which is not always hard to do. When some of the policies that we think are working are, we realize that perhaps some of it is smoke and mirrors. That's hard, but it's better than going into denial. And so lamenting, praying, facing it. It's Lent. We can add that to our prayer as we consider Christ and as we consider Jesus' journey to the cross and on into Easter. So I really appreciate being here with all of you. Thank you. And Andrew, I'll leave the close to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon. So many good policy initiatives are available. I do want to share one more thing, and this is something I learned from one of my policy gurus. Her name is Leah Stokes, Stokes, and she's a professor at UC Santa Barbara, and very wise and positive when it comes to climate policy. And what she reminded us all is she and her team did a survey of all of the elected officials at the state level and federal level, asking them questions to get at their impressions of how important climate change is to their constituents. And across the board, whether it's a red state, a blue state, Democrat, Republican, Independent, the overarching trend is that to the elected officials, their sense of how important climate change is to their constituents is vastly underestimated. In other words, the people in their districts, states, and across the country, people are a lot more concerned about climate change than politicians think. And they're also have, there's a lot more fossil fuel lobbyists who are engaging our elected officials. And so one of the most important things we can do is the city that we live in, the county we live in, is just reach out to your elected official and just let them know that climate change is an important issue, and encourage them to know that if they want to we want to ask them to take climate action and to support policies that are going to help the planet and our societies and future generations. And, just let them know, because if they don't feel that people are behind them, they're going to be less willing to take political risks to support the kinds of policies that we need. So I just want to put that on everyone's heart. Reach out to your elected officials. Friendly conversation, just let them know that you're a constituent, let them know that you care about climate change, and that when they take action, that you are going to support them. And that'll help give them the support they need to take some policy risks to do the right thing. So I'd like to bring our webinar to a close with a prayer. And so I invite you to an attitude of prayer, and just want to say, loving Creator God, we know that you're right here with each one of us. We know that you're at work in each one of our lives. You're at work across this land. You're at work in this earth and the whole cosmos. You created this all, and it's good. And you also placed within us the qualities of care and compassion. We can take care of this beautiful garden that we've inherited from your goodness and your creative power. So just help be at work in our hearts. Help us to take a step back from the norms of this society, the busyness we get caught up in, and help us realize that we share this planet. This is the only planet we have, and we need to take care of it. And help us extend your creative and good energy and your compassion and your love for all creation. Help it flow through us and inspire us as we take care of this planet and deal with its significant challenges. So pour out your blessings upon us as we do this important work. And thank you for placing the heart of compassion that's in each one of us, tuning into this call, and in all the work that people who aren't on the call are doing. Lift up this prayer to you. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
And next time, our next week will be climate justice, a global movement. Hope you can come. Go in peace.